As we continue our conversation about the Constitution, I want to talk today about Americans and their rights. I mean, if you go back to Magna Carta, let's start there and what the expectation was of the nobility and the people, and then compare it to what we have.
You need to think of it as sort of a widening funnel, or almost like a tornado with a tiny bit at the bottom and then widening up and up and up. You know, one question to ask yourself, Sam, is where do rights come from? Have we always had rights? Were rights invented by the Enlightenment? How did this come about? It's a sort of a mystery, but not all people on earth have always thought that they had rights. The idea that I have the right to remain silent, or I have the right to be left alone, or I have the right to a lawyer when accused of a crime. These are not things that were in the ancient world. These sort of burbled up through the course of Western civilizational history. And there are key sort of landmark moments in this. Our Bill of Rights is certainly one of them, but it goes back much, much farther. And you can take it back to the Magna Carta, 1215, so the 13th century. It's in Great Britain at Runnymede. And the Magna Carta is essentially a document in which a group of aristocrats, of very powerful, wealthy, landed nobles, petitioned the king and said, we have the right to petition. We have rights that can't be trampled upon by the crown. And so this was not for you and me and an average American citizen. This was for the very powerful upper crust of British noble society. But nevertheless, it was sort of the first crack in the idea that the king has all power and everybody else just has to get along. That's 1215. Now you flash forward to the 17th century in England, and you have the British Civil War. And during the 17th century, the British people, led by Cromwell and others, asserted some rights as against the crown, and even some rights as against Parliament. And you have, after the Civil War, the Restoration, the culmination of the Glorious Rebellion in 1688, and the British Bill of Rights in 1689. So if the first great landmark in this story is the Magna Carta, the second great landmark is the British Bill of Rights of 1689. Now it transfers. The colonial movement transfers all of this over to the United States, to the colonies, and of course in 1776, Thomas Jefferson says the best thing ever said. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are born equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson says, birth confers rights. All humans have rights. Rights aren't granted by kings. Rights aren't granted by priests. Rights aren't granted by Parliament. We have them. They come with birth. They're inherent in us. And any government that is a legitimate government cherishes our rights, protects them, avoids trampling upon them. What a statement. All men are born equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And in saying that, Jefferson is basically saying governments are always a necessary evil. Governments are always on probation because they tend to get in the way of our rights.
Now, some would say rights, or is it really order?
Well, there is that. You see, every society, I mean, if you think about it, if you think of people living in a state of nature, just if you and I were the only two people on an island, and you had half the island and I had half the island, and I like to play my stereo very loud at night and you like to sleep early, we'd come to terms and you'd say, hey, I can't stand that. And this happens to people all the time. And we would work something out. We'd say, all right, what if I agree to shut my music off at 10 o'clock, but you aren't then having your chickens making all that noise at dawn? And so we come to an agreement. And if the larger it gets, the more codified this has to be until there are written laws. And maybe after 100 years, one of us is the king, and he just decides what everybody's going to do, when we're going to get up and when we're going to go to sleep, and what the curfew laws are. But in a democratic system or in a republic, you form a majority system, and you codify these things. And so there are rights: my right to be left alone, my right to graze my pig wherever I want, my right to play my stereo. And then there are civic responsibilities, and all rights have to be balanced against public order. And so our Constitution, which is the next step after the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution says, in a certain sense, it says, okay, we get it about rights, but there has to be order too. The Articles of Confederation were more about rights and more about getting rid of the British than they were about creating an orderly society. Now, in 1787, we're going to move in and create some more order. And the paradox of the Constitution, Sam, is that these people, George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, were trying to preserve the rights package as much as humanly possible, and yet to bring order to it and to try to find a balance so that enough order to make this thing work, not too much order so it looks like British tyranny all over again under a domestic guise. And that's really what the debate was about between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, those who wanted to ratify. Jefferson was one of those who believed the Constitution went too far towards order. That order is good, but you can go too far, and when you do, it starts to erode rights.
It becomes more of a monarchy.
It could be monarchy, it could be aristocracy. He certainly believed it was too centralized. So this is this dynamic debate, how do you find the balance? And James Madison is really the genius of this. His view was, look, you've got to have enough order so that you can secure people, so that people feel that this thing is going to work, so that foreign countries feel that it's going to work and are willing to invest in the future of America. And you have to have enough order to put down insurrections and to fight defensive wars against aggressors, and so that there has to be some lively energy at the center of a culture. It's not just your rights.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the idea of having to appease foreigners so that they would invest in the country.
Well, that was it. You see, we like to talk about this in civics as if it's all about constitutions and bills of rights and so on, but in fact, America's been a commercial entity from the beginning. If we stand for anything, it's unlimited resources. That's why, among other things, we were able to help win World War II. Just our production capacities, our rivers, our forests, our mines, our metals. America's always been, in some sense, about commerce. And so the Founding Fathers were worried, how are we going to sell all this stuff without the protection of the British colonial system? They were the shipping, they had the navies to protect our boats on the high seas. They were our monetary system and maintain the value of the currency. Suddenly that's all gone, and you have to invent a country. You have to invent your coinage, you have to invent your standards of weights and measures, you have to figure out if you're going to have a navy to protect your shipping, how's the law of contract going to be upheld, and what are you going to do about the Indians of the West who aren't too happy about all this resource extraction? And suddenly these Founding Fathers realized, oh my goodness, it's easier to whine about oppression than it is to actually create an orderly society.
Well, now what was the difference between the nobility who created the Magna Carta and the wealthy landowners who created the Constitution?
Well, they weren't nobles in the sense that these Europeans were at Runnymede. If you look at this rights tradition, it just keeps expanding. So in 1776, let's say, the rights have now expanded beyond kings and nobles and priests to something like white males of a certain minimal property base. And the Founding Fathers thought they died and gone to heaven. Whoa, man, we're including everybody here. We only look at it from what they didn't include. Women weren't included, African Americans weren't included, foreign nationals weren't included, poor whites weren't included. So you have blacks, women, Indians, poor people who are out of the picture. So they were smug about how wide this was. We judged them. But the good thing about this, Sam, is that our Constitution is an open-ended document, and through the course of American history, we've caught up. The first great amendments after the Bill of Rights were the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, 1865, 1868, 1870. Blacks, not black women, but black men. No more slavery, equal protection, and black men can vote. Then there's this other lag until the 1920s, the progressive movement, and in 1919 with the 20th Amendment, you get women fully franchised for the first time in American history. And then in 1924, the Snyder Act which enfranchised American Indians. And so now you've moved to include black men and women, all women, and Native Americans who had been left out of the original Constitution because they were regarded as foreign countries. So now you've got basically the whole gamut, but it goes farther. In the 1970s, 1971, 18-year-olds can vote. So now we've expanded the electorate, the full citizens, to include everyone from 18 until the time of their death. And you have things like the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 or the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which keep widening it out farther and farther and farther. And our legislation is sometimes ahead of our Constitution. Our Constitution is sometimes ahead of our legislation. But they're basically saying, hey, if you really think about it, they have rights too. And it just keeps going.
In this episode, we explore the expansion of human rights in the history of Western civilization. At one point, Clay says, birth confers rights. Here's a controversial question for discussion. If the theme throughout history is a continual expansion of human rights, then could rights extend to a human fetus? All right, so the breakthrough would have been, after the Bill of Rights, would have been the 14th Amendment, which was the post-war amendments.
It's so interesting, Sam, from a constitutional historical point of view to look at the history of the amendments to the Constitution, because first of all, the Founding Fathers intended amendments to the Constitution of the United States. They created an open-ended document, but they wanted to make sure that these amendments were not very easy to ratify, so that there would be few of them, and there would be something like national unanimity on questions that led to amendments. So you get the first 10 amendments almost immediately. They're, in a sense, the second Constitution. The Constitution is written in 1787. The people say, no way are we ratifying this without a Bill of Rights. James Madison produces the Bill of Rights in 1791. It's ratified in 1791. And that, in a sense, finishes the Constitution. So you could regard that as in the constitutional settlement of the 1780s and early 90s. Then there are a couple of little amendments, but nothing after 1804 until the Civil War. So from 1804 until 1868, there isn't a single amendment to the Constitution of the United States.
Were none proposed?
Oh, of course, proposed all the time, but nothing rose. There was no national crisis of sufficient magnitude or no sense of new enlightenment or opportunity of sufficient drama to lead to an amendment. So there's this kind of quiet period where we've gotten our constitutional settlement, and then from 1804 until the Civil War finally happened, the country's trying to operate, in a sense, under that software. Doing pretty well, but of course, you know what the problem in the software is. What are you going to do about slavery? What are you going to do about the African Americans that have been imported to this culture as workers, as enslaved peoples? And the country really wrestles with this through the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And finally, the system breaks down. Lincoln is elected in 1860, and he can't hold the Union together. The Union shatters. And Lincoln has to make a key decision. Do I let this happen? Do I just let it break up? Or do I have some moral or federal responsibility to hold it together? Lincoln makes one of the most courageous decisions in American history. He says the Union must be preserved. We have to maintain this constitutional union. And he, as you know, he says, look, if I can save the Union without dealing with slavery, I'm going to do it. If the only way I can save the Union is to come to terms with slavery, I'll do that too. But it's the Union that I'm worried about. Slavery it has to be regarded as subordinate. So the Civil War happens. The Civil War is a war. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed. It's also a constitutional crisis, the greatest constitutional crisis in American history. And after the war, in 1865, 1868, and 1870, you get these next three profoundly important amendments. The 13th Amendment, 1865, no slavery. The 15th Amendment, 1870, black men can vote. And in between, the 14th Amendment, 1870, 1868, arguably the most important moment in the constitutional history of the United States. Let me just read you the first section of it. This is, after the Constitution itself, this is probably the most significant paragraph ever written in the Constitution. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Nothing special there. But now, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Sounds abstract, but what it means is that Alabama can't lag behind the rest of the country in its respect for the rights of African Americans or women or Indians or anybody else. That the best standards of the rights in the country apply to the entire country. And the United States and the states are not two different entities. The United States is America now. You know, the cliche is that before the Civil War we said the United States are. After the Civil War we say the United States is. The 14th Amendment says it's going to be uniform. It's not going to be different in one part of the country from in the other. The best standards of respect and due process and the rights of man and women are going to be equally applied throughout the country. And the national constitution is not just the federal constitution anymore, it's the constitution for the entire population of the United States. A lot of people, of course, object to this, but this is the fundamentally important language that allowed us to move on after the Civil War. And every extension of the rights tradition since 1868 has gone immediately back to this paragraph.
Well, your reading of that amendment leads me to ask you about a topic that comes up constantly over the last 30 years, which is states' rights. And what are the abilities of states to be able to pass laws independently of the Constitution?
Almost not at all. I mean, so the states, in particular, at least the states of the American West, talk about this all the time and sort of rattle the constitutional sword and demand respect for the 10th Amendment, which says that the powers not delegated to the national government belong instead to the states and to the peoples. But Sam, effectively, the 14th Amendment clause that I read, Section 1, negates the 10th Amendment. It means that the state of Oklahoma can't really do much different from any other state. It can have a different speed law. It can have maybe it's 180 days for schools to be in session rather than 187. But the maneuverability within a state after the 14th Amendment is very small, because the 14th Amendment effectively nationalizes the whole system and says, whatever a person has a right to have in Massachusetts, that person has a right to have in Oklahoma or in North Dakota or Nevada or Alaska. That states can't lag behind on the rights tradition. They can decide whether they want a holiday on the day the Constitution of that state was ratified, but they can't negate those parts of our culture which are truly national in scope. And so this really offends states that want to have more authority, but our system simply doesn't permit it. And effectively you could say that the Civil War settled that question, that the Civil War said, if the states are going to be freelancing, this thing is never going to work. So we're done with that. We're not going to allow the states to freelance anymore. We'll give them enough authority so they don't think that they're negated, but we're not going to give them the kind of broad authority that the Founding Fathers intended.
Give me a brief answer then to what happens with, for example, Oregon's assisted suicide law.
Well, they usually get struck down. These laws that are passed within individual states are usually challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court effectively applies a national standard and says Oregon's deviation from the national standard represents a threat to the kind of basic rights unity that we have in the culture, and so we're striking it down. And they find different language to strike these things down, but it happens all the time. The Supreme Court recently struck down California's desire to expand its own environmental protections within the state, because the 14th Amendment has created the uniform standard of the culture. And so states would like a little more maneuvering room than they get.
Let's talk about what the founding fathers would have thought about in terms of expanding rights. Things like, as you said, African Americans, women, gay rights. How does that all fit in? And what would they have thought?
Well, if it's a good question, Sam. We don't know. We don't know what they would have thought because they didn't live to watch the country evolve. If you had asked Thomas Jefferson in his own time, what would you think of Abraham Lincoln holding the Union together with guns? Jefferson would have been appalled. He would have said there's a natural right of secession and so on. But if Jefferson had grown with the country and realized that if we don't deal with slavery, there cannot be an America, he might have seen things the way Lincoln saw them. So it's always dangerous to try to say, what would the founding fathers think of cloning? What would the founding fathers think of the war on terrorism? What would the founding fathers think of investment in the arts by the national government? We don't really know. But if they were true to themselves, they would have been against African Americans being citizens, I think certainly. And they would be pretty amazed that in the 21st century, African Americans are knocking on the door of being president of the United States, and there is an African American member of the Supreme Court, and there are African American senators and governors. They'd be pretty intrigued and a little, I think, troubled by that. But we don't have to be troubled. We can just see what they planted. That seed is like the mustard seed in the New Testament. It's grown way beyond what Jefferson might have thought. But see, Jefferson said all men are created equal. And when he said that, he meant everybody. Well, he didn't really mean it, but he said it, and he meant it philosophically. And so the history of the country is that the country keeps reading his statement at its most universal level. He might have felt something more limited, but the country has taken him at the widest reading of that in order to move on. And so now we have the point where not only are women fully enfranchised, and African Americans are fully enfranchised, and Indians are citizens of the United States, and 18-year-olds can vote, but now we're wrestling with, can homosexuals be married? The question is, does the rights tradition expand to handle that? The Americans with Disabilities Act said people who are disabled have rights that we have to go out of our way to accommodate those rights, because their disability needs to be compensated for by a generous culture that understands the rights tradition. So who knows where this ends?
Well, and the last brief question then would be, what about non-human entities? What about clean air and clean water, pets?
You're absolutely right. I mean, in the 1980s and 90s, the question was, do trees have standing? Does a redwood have a right to exist? Does a redwood have a right, some kind of an inherent right in nature that a logging company has to respect? The Endangered Species Act was passed in the 1970s, 1973, the Clean Air Act, 1963, with many amendments bringing it, and subsequent legislation bringing it into a wider embrace. Pets. We're getting to the point where that rights tradition that goes back to the Magna Carta is going to blow by the human boundaries. If you just think about that for a minute, it's astounding that the rights tradition, which we think has to do with us, Homo sapiens, in the 21st century and beyond may expand to pigs. Pigs have rights to be raised in dignity. Trees have inherent rights to continue to exist on Earth, that there's a right not to have an extinction in a species. We'll see. Humans are a little edgy about that, but we'll see.